Now, let's talk about this Jewish nation-state law, which has come in this week. There's also this big assault on Gaza. We've just heard another one. So this bill is going to allow Jews and Arabs to be segregated. The law of Jewish supremacy, some are calling it, a son of the former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, founder of Netanyahu's Likud party, actually abstained from the vote. He warned the party's growing disconnect from human rights. So the bill is passed. It means Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people, who have the unique right of national self-determination. Flag and the menorah, national symbols, well, we already know that, really. Jerusalem will be the capital, not Tel Aviv. And there's a whole another list, which I'll put up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, and a link to some articles detailing this law, because it really is a totally and utterly racially supremacist law.
Well, in other words, they're coming out of the closet as an apartheid state, and therefore they have to face sanctions. And I would suggest that the other thing that has to happen is they may lose their seat at the United Nations. There's various, Kosovo doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. Kashmir doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. Why should Israel, if they're not going to play by the rules? That doesn't mean that we're going to go to war with them necessarily, but there's no reason why we should give them a seat at the United Nations if they're not going to play by the rules. Why should we?
Well, we're going to hear now from Alison Weir, and she's from If Americans Knew, a non-profit organisation over in the US, about the infiltration of the American government as far back as the late 19th century by a secret group.
So we're talking about in the late 1800s, there was already a movement in the U.S. to create a Jewish state in Palestine, even though at that time Palestine was fully inhabited and its population was about 95% non-Jewish. It was about 80% Muslim and about 15% Christian, a little under 5% Jewish. So that movement worldwide originally was not really very successful. Most Jews around the world, including within Palestine itself, opposed Zionism. Then in 1914, a prominent American Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, who's very famous. There's a university named after him. He's held in high regard by most Americans, especially those of us that are liberals or progressives, have always respected Brandeis. Well, it turns out that he became the head of world Zionism around 1914 or so. And then he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson. When you become a member of the Supreme Court, the normal behavior is to resign your board affiliations and your connections to various organizations because you're supposed to be neutral, or at least to be perceived as neutral. So Brandeis officially resigned his leadership of the World Zionist Organization, but a number of books disclose this. He remained its leader for quite a while, and his loyal lieutenants would come into the Supreme Court chambers where Brandeis would give them directives to carry out. This is very little known by most Americans and is really considered highly unethical behavior. Then, to get into more of your question and the aspect of this that would probably be more interesting to English listeners, is that Brandeis became, not only was he the head of World Zionism, but he was a leader in what was, according to an article in a scholarly journal, a peer-reviewed Jewish scholarly journal, he was a leader in a secret Zionist society called the Parashim. Normally, I'm not one who believes or expects to find, quote, secret societies, but this was from the U.S. Jewish Historical Quarterly. It's also discussed in a mainstream book by a highly regarded author named Peter Gross, who was at the New York Times for many years, then at Harvard, wrote a number of nonfiction books. So I discovered this connection that Brandeis had to that society. And then reading from Dr. Sarah Schmidt, who's an Israeli professor, and Peter Gross, the American who used to be the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, write that a leader of the Parashim, a man named Horace Callan, who was a professor first at Princeton, then at the University of Wisconsin, came up with the idea of suggesting to the British that they would gain a benefit from announcing a policy in support of Zionism, of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This idea was suggested by Callan, by Professor Callan, an American, and made its way to Britain through various intermediaries in 1915. Now, at that time, Britain really had nothing to do with Palestine. Palestine at that time was under the Ottoman Empire. It was not yet under the British Empire, huge as the British Empire was. The sun did set on the British Empire in Palestine because Palestine was under the Ottomans. So why would Callan suggest that the British would benefit from announcing a policy supporting Zionism? Well, the reason, it turns out, and this is in a number of books. If people get my book, you'll see that it's thoroughly cited. My book is half footnotes, literally. So everything I say, people can look at the source for it. In 1915, as I'm sure we all remember, that was World War I, what was called at the time the Great War. Britain was desperate to have the U.S. come into its side of the war. The first day of battle of the Battle of the Somme, British casualties were about 60,000 men in one day of battle. The problem from Britain's point of view and from the Zionists' point of view, as we'll see later, but from Britain's point of view, was that Americans did not want to enter the, quote, Great War. It had nothing to do with Americans. It was far away and really had little interest to Americans. Woodrow Wilson was reelected to office with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But as I think I just said, the British government very much wanted the U.S. to come on their side of the war. The Zionist leadership in Britain, especially a man named Chaim Weizmann, who later became president of Israel, went to the British government, and he made the claim that he and his colleagues in the U.S., and he especially referred to Brandeis, who was at that time in the Supreme Court and a good friend of Woodrow Wilson, he claimed that through Brandeis and other colleagues in the U.S., they could influence the U.S. to join the war on the side of Britain. And they said that they would do that if Britain would promise that it would then facilitate their efforts to have a Jewish state in Palestine. This is in a number of books, and it was referred to as the Gentleman's Agreement. This is how the Zionists, Israel partisans, although it wasn't yet Israel, so we have to use the political term, which is Zionists, managed to obtain this declaration. Mild as it is, really, in some ways, it opened the door to colonization of Palestine by Jewish immigrants and colonists. This is how they obtained the Balfour Declaration. And another very interesting aspect of it that, again, most of us didn't know, but it seems to be corroborated in a number of books, is that the actual author of the Declaration was not Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister at the time. It was actually a secret Zionist named Leopold Amory. Again, this came out from a Jewish historian who's a very eminent Jewish historian, wrote about this in an article that I first read in the San Francisco Jewish Bulletin, and in a more extensive article and elsewhere, he goes into more detail about Leopold Amory and his secret connections to Zionism and how much he worked so on behalf of Zionism within the British government. And he was the one that authored the final wording of what's called the Balfour Declaration.
Alison Weir there, her book is Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the US Was Used to Create Israel. So some fascinating stuff there and a bit of a revelation. But Martin, you have to kind of go and get her book really, because it's got all the references where she's got all this stuff from in there.
Yeah, well, it all sounds pretty accurate. I've read a book recently about J&M Jeffries, who was the Daily Mail's correspondent in Palestine at the time, and he made it his life's work to expose the shenanigans that went around the Balfour Declaration.
So, according to Craig Murray, the former ambassador, Israel is now openly and unblushingly racist apartheid state with yesterday's new law. Criticising that fact is anti-Semitic under the crazed definition endorsed by the British government, but not quite yet by the Labour Party. It does seem as if this is all going on at the same time. So we've got an extremist racist state being solidified, and at the same time anyone that criticises it in the Labour Party will be expelled.
Yeah, well, we know, because of the Al Jazeera sting that was carried out, that the Israeli embassy in Britain has got £1 million to spend inside the Labour Party getting the results they want. And I have to say to Margaret Hodge and others, have you ever taken any money from the Israelis?
Isn't it MI5's job and the security services' job to stop foreign countries interfering in British politics?
Only in lower sixth A-level politics lectures. MI5 work very closely with various powerful groups, including the Israeli lobby, to do what they do, and they're subpoenaed. They've all been suborned.
Just one last story. Google is facing a record $5 billion fine in the European Union in order to remove Google Chrome from Android. Well, it doesn't seem. It seems almost a pathetic small thing for the European Union to get Google to do, because obviously Android as a operating system is there is no proper security to it, and Google have got the ability to just get into everyone's phone that they feel like at any time.
Well, they are the robber barons of today, aren't they? And they use the monopoly power to try and increase their power, and they work very closely with the intelligence services, and that, of course, could lead to them being sued by their customers for a breach of contract, which could end up being like a PPI scandal, as our friend Kevin Cahill has said. OK,
time to sign off now for the Murdoch News at 8. Thanks to old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. Mohammed Makawi's next with Arabian Nights. Our sister show Dialects on Tuesday at noon at dialectradio.co.uk. You'll find this show's podcast, story links and comment page and our contact details at thisweek.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Do please join us for the Politics Show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless. And don't let those banksters get you down.
National news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.